Mercury is the planet long associated with Hermes, messenger of the gods. He who comes down to earth, very often with a new perspective, a new way to view a problem. And in these next few canti, or verses, this is very much what Dante is guided to do. As we entered into that realm, he tells us, I saw my lady so delighted that the planet itself grew brighter. A cluster of radiant souls drew near, he continues, and every shade approaching us appeared glad through and through, so luminously shone its flooding joy before it as it neared. And all cried out, Behold, someone who will increase our love. And as each one came to us, the shadow seemed filled with delight, judging by the bright glow that came from it. The light whose radiance runs through all the spheres illumines us, one of the souls then says. And if from us thou seek light, take thy will of us and sate thine ears. How lovely it is that the souls appear so sincere in their wish to assist him, and have come down from their dwelling place in the Empyrean to share with him their own struggles on earth. And Dante is bursting with questions, and he looks to Beatrice for her approval. Ask, ask, nor fear thereof, she counsels. Trust them as though the gods themselves should speak. Now Mercury is the planet within medieval cosmology most associated with justice, hope, and ambition. Here, Dante encounters those who did all the right things in life, who were good and true, but secretly, sometimes unbeknown to themselves, pursued hidden self-serving agendas. Like Mercury, whose face is so often hidden by the sun, their innermost intentions had likewise been obscured. In this sphere, they must become conscious of their own hidden motives. Now one of these souls, the former Roman Byzantine Emperor Justinian, introduces himself. Caesar I was, and am Justinian, indicating that his personality remains, but that his earthly status no longer exists in heaven. His major achievement in life had been an overhaul and a new codification of Roman law. He had built churches, dams, bridges and fortifications throughout the empire, culminating with the magnificent rebuilding of the beautiful Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. But he had sought personal acclaim, and his rule was not always wise. It was Justinian who narrow-mindedly closed Plato's academy in Athens in 1529 BC. Yet now free of error, Justinian and his company rejoice in the beatitude assigned to them, says Dorothy Sayers. Dante and Justinian then enter into an extended discourse on a great number of meta-historical and theological themes that ultimately shine new light on some of the great paradoxes of history. Justinian begins poetically with Virgil's Aeneas coming out of Troy, through to the creation and development of Rome and its empire, followed by a great overview of history, all the way down to Dante's own day. But in the end, it's as if this epic tale of empire pales into insignificance when viewed against God's great plan for the soul, which ultimately transcends all. Now, this is not to say that the tragic events of world history are of no consequence, that the everyday affairs of the world are not to be cared about, that we may simply rise above them. No, this is not at all implied. We know by now, if we know anything of Dante, that he cared deeply for the plight of his own times. But there is more to be understood here, more of God's divine purpose. Justinian explains that in order to ascend, he needed to let go of his limited understanding of worldly events, as Dante must. Acceptance is the key, says Mark Vernon, acceptance that somehow elevates us beyond the fixed categories of justice, with its preoccupation with right or wrong, by understanding that although this applies in some cases, at some times, it's never the full story. Our intellects are like the little planet of Mercury itself, struggling to make sense, to shine a light on complex matters, yet ultimately our minds are utterly outshone by a meaning and a purpose only heaven knows. It's a lot to take in, and even Dante struggles, but Justinian hasn't finished yet, and concludes his long address with difficult remarks about the notion of the justice of the sin of the fall being avenged by the crucifixion. It is a notion that greatly troubles Dante, most especially in the light of insights gleaned so far. But it will not be until Justinian and his companions depart to the Empyrean that he will be able, with Beatrice's help, to grasp what is being presented to him. Well, soon the souls begin to sing, Hosanna Sanctus Deus Sabaoth, Hosanna, Holy God of Hosts. And they rise up then, Dante tells us, and I saw him singing, revolving to his own note, and he and the others moved in dance, and, like the swiftest of sparks, suddenly veiled themselves from me in the distance. But Dante still has his burning questions. The notion of a vengeful God, though not uncommon, sits uneasily with him. Beatrice reads his mind and speaks to him, addressing his concerns, and she helps him to achieve a new, transcendent perspective, sub specie eternitatis, from the point of view of eternity that we spoke of earlier. Her words here touch upon an important theological challenge to orthodoxy, mounted by the philosopher Abelard in the 12th century, that Dante the poet would have certainly been aware of. Abelard rejected the idea that Jesus' death was a debt paid to God's honour, and that God was vengeful. Jesus died as a demonstration of God's love, he wrote, a demonstration which can change the hearts and minds of the sinners, turning back to God. Well, Abelard was eventually excommunicated, yet his notions of the atonement have persisted throughout the last millennium. Complex matters indeed, yet the canto forces us to contemplate them. and alongside Dante the Pilgrim, to once more elevate our own consciousness, if we can, to a point beyond duality, beyond black or white, right or wrong, to a third way of knowing, commensurate with a deeper wisdom. The crucifixion, Beatrice explains, was in the deepest sense an occasion for joy. At the time it was a payment for the fall, and yet on another level it was a monstrous crime, a hideous injustice. So it is with all phenomena of history, writes Helen Luke in her commentary. But in that unimaginable totality which is God, in that core of man which is both wholly human and wholly divine, all suffering becomes innocent, as was Christ's, no longer senseless misery, but as a necessity, part of the way of individuation, self-realization, to which we consent. We know the suffering then as a mercy, a grace, beyond all categories of just or unjust. It's hard to lift the mind out of its preoccupation with historical time, to come anywhere close to the subspecie aeternitatis we have spoken of. Things are clearer, perhaps, when transposed into a mythological idiom. God gave us free will. In exercising it, Adam and Eve, our prototypes, came into the world of form, of duality, of knowledge of the third dimension, to embark upon the hero or heroine's journey, as Joseph Campbell suggested. The ultimate goal of all such journeys is to return to source, as it were, to come home to heaven, grown wiser by the experience. Inevitably, the journey involves suffering, the disillusion of the ego, and a relinquishment of any notion of omnipotence. This is the dark night of the soul, our own crucifixion, so to speak, that mirrors that of Christ's, and that purifies and redeems our soul. In his lecture, The Psychology of Redemption in Christianity, Canadian clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson discusses the idea from a psychological perspective, comparing it in part to ideas of transformation in psychotherapy. I believe that what is outlined in the narrative form in the New Testament is psychologically correct, he says. To be redeemed is to aim at the highest value, to sacrifice what's no longer useful and valid in the self, and to tell the truth. And the consequence of that is existence in a deep state of meaning that justifies the tragedy of being and the possibility of transforming your own life in the most beneficial, positive direction, while simultaneously doing that for the people around you. And that's redemption. Throughout, we have been trying to fathom Dante's words in relation to the traditional medieval four-tiered system of interpretation, the literal, allegorical, moral, and anagogical, subspecie aeternitatis, as it were. A possibility throughout the Commedia, of course, but nowhere more apparent than in the Paradiso. But it is not easy. We do not understand the bigger picture. How can we? Even Dante struggles, as we have said, even at this high point in his journey. But with the help of Beatrice and the generous souls who help him, he finally understands. He gets it, so to speak, and all at once, as is the way with such breakthroughs, the pair find themselves rising to a different realm completely, to Venus, the heaven of love. Dante and Beatrice arrive in the third sphere, il cielo de Venere, the heaven of Venus, the morning and evening star, courting the sun, as Dante poetically describes her, rising and falling at his nape and brow. Here, the spirits are so filled with love, says Klein, that to give pleasure is also to receive it. This is the divine aspect of love, that it increases by being mutually experienced, and that shared love is not a loss, but an addition. I did not notice my ascent to it, says Dante, yet I was sure I was in Venus when I saw my lady grow more beautiful. A group of swirling lights approach. Hosanna sounded in such a manner that ever since I have not been free of the desire to hear it again. Dante speaks with 4 of their number, an old true friend, a harlot, a troubadour, and a passionate, unconventional woman, all of whom have loved deeply with full and generous hearts. Each has their tale to tell, but we will focus upon just one, Cunizza, the passionate. She had been an old woman when Dante knew her in Florence, yet as a young girl she had been the lover of Sordello, the poet we met in the Purgatorio. She had 3 marriages after that, and travelled widely. At first glance, she is not dissimilar to Francesca from Canto 5, Inferno, for she too had been overmastered by love. Yet Cunizza is in heaven, not hell. Why? Both were swirled around by love, yet after much reflection, Cunizza shifted to another level of love completely. As Helen Luke explains it, Francesca's desire remained centred on Paolo as a mere projection of her own inner longing, and she circled aimlessly, forever bound to his image. Cunizza, we may be sure, through long years of struggle and suffering, had won through to a reality of relationship and compassion, and all her wandering desires had become one in the wheeling dance around the centre which is love itself. There is such a massive difference here between these two that so perfectly portrays the crucial difference between mature and immature love, the latter commonly exhibiting an unhealthy projection of all things good onto the object of one's affections, only to discover at some later, almost inevitable moment, when the projection slips, that the previously adored one is disappointingly only human after all. Nowhere in the Commedia, says Luke, do we see so clear a revelation of the fact that the 3 realms, of the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso are not places in the literal sense, but states of mind. As Jung so often said, writes Luke, the choice between them lies in the individual's conscious standpoint and willingness to confront his egocentricity. In the end, and this is true for all lovers, here in the sphere of Venus or elsewhere throughout the Commedia, it is not who we love that counts, but as Luke explains, whether that love leads to an increasing consciousness through the sacrifice of the greed of the ego, or whether it leads to a gradual swallowing up of the personality into the hell of concupiscence. And this is why we should not be at all surprised to find prostitutes, homosexuals and heretics, all those that would have been condemned in 14th century Europe, together with the angels in heaven's highest heights.